I'm Jo McRogers, a social worker who supports grief through my video therapy practice, this YouTube channel, and my online private membership community called the Grievolution Collective. Please subscribe, like, and turn on the notifications bell so YouTube knows to reach all of the grievers that are looking for help in our Grief Support That Works community. Our goal here is to do grief differently. Grief, COVID, and mental health. The implications for grief have been far-reaching and largely under-recognized during these COVID times. So today, we're going to explore my humble assessment of grief, anxiety, and COVID implications. As a grief therapist, I can assure you that grief has been largely eclipsed by the implications of the COVID mandates. These are some of the grief situations that I've supported professionally during pandemic times. One of the largest issues was no gatherings, no funerals, no celebrations of life. Grieving in isolation from the death of a loved one was profound. There were no hugs, there were no touch. There was masks, gowns, and gloves between people. There were iPad goodbyes from homes and hospital parking lots. There were briefly timed visits offered once it was clear that the situation was palliative for a loved one. Hospice was limited to the number of visitors who could be present for the death. Maternal care was so hard hit, partners were not allowed into emergency ultrasounds searching for a missing heartbeat. And stillbirths were experienced through masks and protocols instead of love and care. Seniors in quarantine who were living in fear and in isolation, and adult children that were living in crises because they couldn't visit their parents in the long-term care homes. Frontline workers that needed to be hypervigilant about contracting or carrying home the virus, which led to home routines of decontamination that are extensive, intrusive, and exhaustive. Undressing in garages, leaving shoes outdoors, scrubbing hands until they were raw. Most frontline workers vicariously were carrying the grief of the others that they had to witness. And people that are drawn to frontline work are often drawn there because they are drawn to people. But doing this through protective gear and masks was a large cost that many professions paid. There was increased isolation. Guilt shows up for so many people in not being able to be with their loved one as that person passed or not being able to hold their hand. Often in grief, getting it right is an important part of grief, both during caregiving and for funerals. But this left us with no opportunity to do this right, so we're left with that residue. Grief is an isolating experience. Clients told me that they didn't want to reach out to anybody else because everyone else was busy dealing with their own stuff during the pandemic. No physical hugs meant no release of stress-busting hormones. Months later, delayed funerals or celebrations of life are now being questioned as everyone just wants to move on and find some happiness or normalcy. It feels like a step backwards for many people to think of holding a celebration of life now from 2 years ago. Personal identities and relationships are being redefined now. Division showed up within families, friends, marriages, colleagues, neighbors. Many have never felt so divided as they do now. We learned a lot about each other. Who bends the rules, who adheres to the rules, who enforces the rules, who shames, who passes judgment, and who supports. We might not have known this about each other had the pandemic not happened. The central question during the pandemic has been how to stay safe while facing immortality, others and yours. Leave your comments below about how you feel the pandemic may have impacted you and your grief. So here is loss. It always involves grief. It often involves tragedy, and sometimes it also includes trauma. This is what the pandemic did to loss. It elevated it. It added friction to the background and the foreground of grief during pandemic times. The pandemic called for vigilance. Grief also cultivates vigilance, hypervigilance, often for health and safety. The net outcome is that anxiety results from not feeling safe, and grief grafts onto grief. Now, please remember that it wasn't that long ago that we were following arrows on grocery store floors. Children's playgrounds were closed and roped off. We were told to double mask. There were curfews, loss of businesses and income, gyms, sports, arts, theater, travel were all shut down. There was this massive loss of lives. The media was full of horror stories of overloaded morgues and refrigerator trucks housing bodies outside of hospitals. The pandemic caused cumulative grief. It's like a bereavement overload that stacked grief upon grief. During the pandemic, we felt we needed to be in a constant state of cost benefit risk analysis. Is it safe to go to the store? Do I need to wash my groceries? Can I still go into my office? Can I risk taking off my glove to touch the hand of my dying loved one? How do I protect my kids? How do I protect my elders? What we didn't actually know was the difference between threat versus risk. Now, risk can be calculated. It can be assessed against our vulnerabilities. A threat cannot be assessed, but it looms, waiting to exploit our vulnerabilities. This is what we thought we needed in the pandemic. But this is what we actually had to face. It is the threat. The storm is looming. Will it arrive or not? The pandemic brought a sense of constant threat, largely unrecognized. It seemed like risk analysis. This in turn creates a sense of helplessness. There is something much larger than us that we can't fix. This combination is the perfect invitation to anxiety. For so many, the anxiety eclipsed the grief. It exaggerated the tragedies, it extended the trauma. People who have had experience with anxiety in the past were having a return of high anxiety. And people who had never experienced anxiety before didn't know what to call it. And we were all undergoing this all the while our brains are trying to protect us and normalize this experience. Please don't allow this to be normalized or minimized. As the pandemic mandates change and lessen, please show some self-compassion and other compassion. Please know to expect changes in yourself, in others, and in relationships. Our core beliefs of trust and certainty and predictability, loss of control, and grief have been central to the pandemic. Have you any suggestions of what has helped you to process these times? Please, in the comments below, share so that we can all learn together. My request to you is to recognize the toll of these recent pandemic times. Please don't deny the residue that we are all feeling. It is all grief-related. It is all anxiety-related. Please seek support and help to process this unprecedented time kindly. So as you acknowledge and do your inventory of the COVID-19 grief and anxiety you've experienced, I send you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. Thank you and take good care.